Hello and welcome back to How to Build an AI, the Chronicles of Jobot. In this series, we are walking through the process of building Jobot, an AI or an artificial intelligence agent with many capabilities, such as intelligence powered by GPT-3, skills powered by prompts, hearing and speech powered by the Whisper and Neural 2 APIs, and memory powered by embeddings and databases, creativity powered by DALL-E 2 and Stable Diffusion, and Vision powered by GPT-4 when that releases. And Jobot is accessible via a web app and a REST API. And today we're going to focus on building some part of Jobot's memory. And we're also going to make improvements to the web app and the REST APIs. So let's get into it. The topic for today is Jobot's trip down memory lane. And so far, what we've built out is an interface like this, where you can either go in and ask any question to Jobot, or you can pick one of these templates or one of these skills, and you can then go in and ask a question with respect to a specific skill. Now today we want to give Jobot the ability to remember things, to remember previous conversations. So here's what it looks like. Let me first log in here. So I'm just going to go in here, type in my email, and send a verification code. And today I'll talk about how you can build your own application like this without having to write a lot of code yourself. Okay, now I will get a verification code on my email. So I'm grabbing that verification code and pasting it here. And let me sign in. And once I'm signed in, you can see now that there is this sidebar similar to what you have on ChatGPT. Very, very similar, in fact. And you can close this sidebar. So this is the normal view that you already have. And this is the open sidebar. And now if you ask Jobot a question, let's say, what is the meaning of 42, and hit enter, you will see that Jobot is going to reply as it normally does. But once Jobot is done replying, you will see here that the sidebar, it now gets populated with a new entry. And now I can go back in here into new chat and I can start a new chat. What is the meaning of 41? And now there will be a second conversation here. And this conversation, as soon as Jobot finishes replying, is going to get added over here as what is the meaning of 41. Now I can always go back into what is the meaning of 42 over here, and I can continue this conversation. And this conversation is going to continue over here. However, I can always now go back to a previous conversation to make sure that I can go and continue previous conversation. Now this works not just with these plain messages that you can type here. This works with any of these as well. Let's say I'm using the lead code assistant, and let's say I'm solving a question which says print hello world in Python. And let's say the code I've written is console.log hello Jobot. And I tell it that I'm trying to code this in the Python programming language. I can say start conversation, and that is then going to, Jobot is then going to reply based on this prompt that we have configured that our code is incorrect, and we should be using the print function, not the console.log function. And it's a JavaScript function, and there's a missing quotation mark. And you can see here that a new entry here has been added. Now this is not very pretty. We can probably make this slightly better. The title of this right now, it's simply picking up the first user prompt as the title of the conversation. We should probably add an option to edit the title here as well. But now we have all forms of memory, and now we can go back in here and start another conversation. Let's say I can start a mock interview for a data analyst role. Yep. And I can then come back into one of these older ones, and I can continue where I left off. Okay, so that's basically what we've added today. We have added the ability for Jobot to remember previous conversations and continue previous conversations. And we've done that by providing this sidebar. And you can always go into new chat to start a new chat, but otherwise you have this sidebar to continue building things. All right. So now the next thing I want to show you, and that's all this is in terms of the functionality, but the next thing that I'm going to show you is how all of this can be accessed using an API, so that you don't have to build out this entire backend. You can interact with Jobot. As we said, you can interact with Jobot and all of its abilities using an API, using a bunch of REST APIs. So that's what we're going to look at. So let me go into the docs here. And let us look at, so let us look at the documentation here for Jobot. And so far now we've given it intelligence, we've given it some skills using pre-configured prompts, we've given it conversations, conversation memory. The next kind of memory is a knowledge base. Let's say with a particular skill, you wanted to associate a bunch of documents that Jobot can refer to while answering questions or having conversations for that skill. However, what we would like to do is we would like to allow people to build things like Discord bots, Slack bots, WhatsApp bots, iOS and Android apps, VS Code extensions, voice assistants, all of these things using Jobot. And the way to make that happen is using a REST API, okay, a JSON API. So now, if I go down here into API access, it says aside from the web app, you can access Jobot via the following API endpoints to build your own AI-powered application. So let's say we were building a simple mobile application. All right, and we would write this mobile application either in Kotlin or in JavaScript using a framework like React Native. And now to allow users to interact with Jobot and to allow users to have a history of their conversations, the first thing we would need to do is allow users to log in, right? So to allow users to log in to Jobot, then we can use this endpoint, jobot.jovian.com/API/auth/send OTP. So I can come in here into a REST client. I'm not going to create an actual mobile app today. I'm just going to use a REST client, which is a testing tool to test out these APIs. So I want to create an HTTP request, and let me give this the name, generate OTP or a one-time password. And this is going to be a post request to jobot.jovian.com/send OTP. And I am going to, let's see, I'm going to give it a JSON body. And in the body, I am going to send an email. Let's say the email that I'm going to send is sydney@jovian.com. All right. And now let us set some headers here. Okay, content type application JSON, I think that is good enough. So if you see the documentation here, it says it's a post method. This is the API endpoint, and this is a request body, email of type string, and you're going to get a response. If things go fine, it's going to say verification code send. So let me click send, and it takes a couple of seconds. So it's going to call the Jobot REST API, and hopefully it says verification code sent. Okay, perfect. So a verification code has been sent. And now what we can do using this verification code is generate an API key for that particular user. So let's now verify OTP. So let's create a new API endpoint. Let's call this verify OTP and generate API key. And this API key is going to be, or let me just call it get API key. And this API key is going to be used for making requests, creating conversations and things like that. Okay, so let me go in here into post, and for verifying and generating an API key, this is the endpoint. All right, let me grab that endpoint right here. So it is /API/auth/verify OTP. And now it has the body. It has a JSON body again. And here we need to pass in an email. So let me see, I'm going to enter the same email, sydney@jovian.com, that I was using right now. And we need to pass in the code that was sent using the previous API. So you can imagine that in your Android application, you might create maybe an interface like this, where you have first a button where people can enter their email, or a text box where they can enter their email. And once they've entered their email, then you might have this verify or send OTP button, all right, like that. And once they click send OTP, then you can show a box where you ask them to enter the OTP that was sent to their email. And once they've entered the OTP, so let's get enter OTP in here. And once they've entered the OTP, you can then show a button called login, and that will verify the OTP, and that will log them in, and they can then continue using the application. All right, so that is the kind of flow that you can possibly build out in a mobile app or in a Discord bot or wherever, right? So now I'm going to enter the code that was sent. So let me grab the code that was sent over email, and let me post that in here, and let me click send. And this, okay, now it says, I've put the wrong email address. That's why I got an error, and it says bad request. So let me put the right email, and hopefully now this should give me an API key. So I get back in the response an API key, Let me just copy this key and keep it around for later use, so that I'm then going to use this key to create conversations, and I'm then going to use this key to interact with the Jobot. All right. So with that, now we have created a particular API key. So what can we do with the API key? Well, let's keep going. So the first thing you can do is you can just send messages to the ChatGPT API behind the scenes and get back a response. So this is not going to create any conversations. This is just for testing things out. So there is a separate set of APIs for actually creating and updating conversations. So let's just test this out. Okay. So the endpoint here is /chat or /API/chat. So let me just call this chat API or chat completion. All right. And this is again a post endpoint, and it is at /API/chat. So let's go https jobot.jovian.com/API/chat. We should probably change this to the entire URL. So let me just change that right here so that it's correct. Yeah. So this should be jobot.jovian.com/API/chat. And let me just commit this directly to the main branch. And let's come back. Yeah. So /API/chat is the endpoint. All right. And the body is going to be JSON. And it expects you to send a body like this, where you mention the model that you want to chat with, you mention the messages, and you mention whether you want to stream the response or not. Now, if stream is true, then the response will be streamed token by token, like it is done here. Like for example, if I say what about 80, you're going to see that the response is going to come token by token. So in the same way, if stream is true, then the response will be streamed token by token. So I'm going to copy this and I am going to paste this in here. Model is GPT 3.5 Turbo. Messages. Okay, let's put a couple of messages here. Let's put a system message and a user message. And let's make it a little interesting this time, instead of just giving it the system message Jobot. So in the system message, let's say, you are Job and you respond sarcastically to every message. Okay. And now if I just say, and make up facts. All right. So I'm putting this system message in here. I'm putting this user message in here, and I can just send it. But if I try to send it, it's going to say that this is unauthorized. Oh, well, looks like we actually do have the authorization header here. But yeah, in this case, it says, oh, I'm no one special, just your friendly neighborhood AI assistant, but my friends call me super awesome mega turbo AI. And that's it. I think we need to have an authorization header here as well. Maybe we have a bug in our code which allows people to chat without an authorization header. But here's what we can do. We can set an authorization header where we say bearer, and we paste in the API key that we have used earlier. So it's possible that the REST client is preserving the session from the previous request. But ideally, what you need to do is you need to provide a header content type application JSON, and then you need to provide an authorization with an API key. And that API key is going to be used to identify which user you're chatting with. And that's going to respond. Okay. So it says, oh, I'm no one special, just a friendly neighborhood AI assistant, but my friends call me super awesome mega turbo AI. All right. So this is how you can give Jobot, or whatever app you're building, you can give the bot a name, you can give the bot a personality, and give it instructions on how to work. Okay. So that is a chat completion API. This does not create a conversation history. This is just for getting the next message in a particular set of messages. Okay. Now let's keep going. Let's check out maybe a few more APIs. So here is one endpoint which will get the list of all the conversations for a particular user using their API key. So let's go in. Let's create an HTTP request. Let's see list user conversations. Let's call it that. And this is simply a endpoint where you say /API/conversations, and then you have to provide an authorization header. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to provide a header authorization and bearer, and I'm going to put in here the API key. bearer API key, and let's hit send. And now in a few seconds, we should get back all the conversations that this particular user has had. So Sydney at jovian.com, you can see here, Sydney has had 1, 2, 3, 4 conversations. And you can verify here that there are 4 conversations here in the result. Right? So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 conversations. And the first conversation is what is the meaning of 42? And you can see here in the first conversation, these are the messages. You are Jobot. What is the meaning of 42? The number 42 has gained significant cultural reference. What about 79, etc., etc. Similarly, you have the second conversation here. And the second conversation is something about, let's see, let's close the first one. Yeah, it's about what is the meaning of 41. So similar stuff. The third conversation here, which is, let's see, something about you are a virtual coding evaluator. So in this case, we were doing a lead code assistant conversation. So that is captured here. So in this way, we can get in JSON format all the previous conversations that a particular user has had. Okay, so list user conversations, that is one API endpoint. Another endpoint is to list or get the details for a particular conversation. Let me maybe show that first before we go into creating conversations. So get single conversation or conversation messages. All right. Maybe what we might want to do is from the list endpoint, we might want to remove the messages. We might not want to actually show all the messages. We just want to keep the list of conversations. And from the conversation messages is where we might want to actually include all the messages. Otherwise, our sidebar query might become too heavy. But that's something that we can look at over time. So let's say I want to get the details for a particular conversation. So what I need to do is I need to grab the ID of that particular conversation. So that's another UUID. And I need to go in here and I need to type in jobot.jovian.com/API/conversations/the conversation ID. And let's put in the header here. So authorization bearer, and let's grab the header like that, and let's hit send. And now we should get the details just for this particular conversation. So now you can see here, it's the data here is only the data for a single conversation. And we have the full list of messages in this conversation. And in this conversation, we have had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 messages. And in each message, we have an ID, we have a created at, we have a role, we have the content of the message. And that is basically what is used to render this information. So we have, of course, the content, we have the role, and we have an ID and created at, because all these messages are being stored in a database. All right, so that's it. So that is how the API works for getting the conversation messages for a particular conversation. Let's now check out the API to create a conversation. So let's go to create conversation. And this is going to be a post API. And this is going to use the same URL as the list conversations. So we just go to jobot.jovian.com/API/conversations. Then we put in the authorization header. So let's put in authorization bearer, and let's get the API key in here as well. And once again, let us now go in and let us add a body now. It needs a JSON body. And let's see what it takes to create a conversation. So to create a conversation, all you need to do is just provide a list of messages. And I think we should fix this. This should say system and user. So let's fix this documentation as well while we are at it. Let's see. So we are talking about the create conversation, and the role, probably the first role you might want to pass is system. And the second role that you might want to pass is user, something like that. So whenever the user makes their first request, that is when you might want to just create the conversation initially and then do something with it. So let's see. So system, well, you are Jobot, a helpful assistant developed by Jovian. And let's give it a user message. Hello, who are you? Okay. So let us take these messages and let us commit this back directly to master. Okay. Let's come back into the create conversation. Yeah. So all we need to send is a list of messages. And what this will do is this will create a conversation. This will actually not call the chat API. This will simply create a conversation. So what you might want to do is the user sends a message. So you take a system message, you take the user message, you create a conversation first, and then you take the conversation history, send it to the chat API, and then you get the result back, and then you update the conversation, right? So this is just so that you have more control, and we'll maybe look at a diagram for this as well. But let me just send this now. And now in a few seconds, you should see that a new conversation has been created, and it just says sample conversation title because the title for the conversation that we passed here is sample conversation title. And now if I go back into the list user conversations and I hit send, you should see that at the very end, our new conversation would have been added. So now our new conversation has been added, sample conversation title. And in our new conversation, we have two messages. You are Jobot, a helpful assistant developed by Jovian, and hello, who are you? Okay. So we have a couple of messages here. Now what we can do is take the messages from the created conversation and send them to the chat completion API. Let me just grab these messages and replace it over here. So send them to the chat completions API like that. All right. And let us now send this and get the response back. And we get back a response saying, hello, I am Jobot, a helpful assistant developed by Jovian. How can I assist you today? And now we can take this response and then add it back to the existing conversation. Okay. So let's take a look at how to do that. So to update an existing conversation, what you can do is you use post, and the URL is the same URL that you use for getting the conversation messages. So you use it for updating a conversation. So jobot.jovian.com/API/conversations/conversation ID. And of course, you need the authorization header. So let's put in the authorization header with the bearer token over here. This is the token, the API key. And let's add a body, JSON. And let's take a look at what the body looks like to update a conversation. So here is how you retrieve a conversation messages. Here is how you update a conversation. So all you need to do is provide again a list of new messages that need to be passed in. So let me just grab that and put that in here and get rid of this sample value and grab the response that I obtained after sending a message to the chat completion API. So this is the response I obtained after sending a completion to the chat or sending a message to this chat completion API. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add this to this existing conversation. And remember, the conversation ID is in the URL. Okay, like that. And let me just go send that. And hopefully now we'll get back the entire conversation with all three messages. Okay, so now we have the message, you are Jobot. Then we have what is the meaning of 42. Then we have the number 42 has gained significant cultural references. And then we have, oh, sorry, this seems to be the wrong conversation. I pushed it to the wrong conversation. Let me just grab the right conversation ID over here. Yeah, like that. Okay, so we created a new conversation. So we need to send these messages to the new conversation. And now you can see here, we have the response. Sample conversation title. Hello, I'm Jobot, a helpful assistant developed by Jovian. You are Jobot. There is a system message. Hello, who are you? Okay, looks like these messages are out of order. So we may need to fix the order in which the messages are fetched. So we have, of course, we have a few bugs to fix here and there, and that we will fix when we are looking at the code shortly. But that is basically how we do things. So just to recap the flow here, the way this works is first, it's two parts. Let's just set this up real quick so that we can take a look at it. All right, so the way this works is we have two parts. The first part is authentication or auth, and the second part is conversation. Okay, So what you should do when you're building an application with Jobot is first call the generate OTP. And here you need to provide the email. Okay, so you provide an email and that generates an OTP. Then you take that OTP and you send the OTP and the email to verify OTP. So here you provide the email and you provide the OTP, and you're going to get back an API key. Okay, so this API key ideally is something that you should save maybe in a cookie somewhere, or maybe in your local storage. If it's a mobile app, save it in the local storage. If it is a Discord bot, save it somewhere against that user. So for that particular user, you have that API key. That is how you recognize them. Then once you have an API key for a particular user, here is how you can create conversations for that user. So the first thing you do is you take you call the create conversation. So you probably are showing some kind of a user interface where the user can enter a message and hit send. So in the create conversation, maybe you take the initial messages. So you take the initial messages that would involve maybe a system message and maybe a user message, and send it to create conversation. That's going to give you a conversation with an ID. All right. So now you're going to have a conversation ID, and you can get the list of previous messages from that conversation ID. Now, the second thing you should do is you should call the chat completions API. All right. So you can call the chat completions API with the full conversation history, and you give it the entire conversation history. So the full list of messages for that conversation, and it is going to give you the new message. All right. And the new message is going to be streamed. So you can possibly stream that message. And that is why this API is separate, so that you can stream that message token by token, display it on your user interface. And finally, you can call the update conversation API. And to the update conversation API, all you do is maybe just provide the new messages. So you give it the new messages, and you're going to get back the full conversation history. All right. So that's what happens. So that's basically how the whole thing works. You first ask the user to maybe enter a couple of messages. You then take that and call the completions or save that conversation, get a conversation ID. Then you take the full API, you take the full history of messages, send it to the completions API. That gives you a response. You take that response and maybe update the conversation. And once you've updated the conversation, then of course you can also just stream the message as it is coming in. And once you've updated the conversation, the entire conversation history gets updated. All right. So that's basically how the whole thing works. And of course, you have a couple of API endpoints to list the entire set of conversations for a user, and to view the messages for a particular conversation to get its history. Okay. So that was how the REST API works. And now let's maybe take a quick look at what the behind the scenes structure for this looks like. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the database structure. So we have added a couple of database database tables. So there's one table here called, or three database tables actually. There's one table here called API key. There's one table here. Yeah. So API key is going to contain all the keys for this particular that you generate for various users. And of course, it contains the key value itself. It contains a user ID and it contains a name. Now, the programmatically generated ones will have a name like this, which is related to the timestamp. Then there is a conversations table, which simply has an ID, a created at, a user ID, and a title, right? So for each conversation that we see here in the sidebar, yeah, so for each conversation that we see here, you can see sample conversation title is here. For each conversation here that we see in the sidebar, we get we have a conversation, an entry in the conversation table with the title. Then we have a messages table, and in the messages table, we simply have a bunch of messages. So each message has an ID, each message has a created at, each message has a conversation ID. Each message has a role, of course, the kind of role that we use to decide what should be rendered here. And then each message has some content. Okay, so that's basically what happens. And of course, for a particular conversation, you're going to have a bunch of messages. So if you filter by a particular conversation ID, you'll get back all the messages for that conversation. Okay, so that is the database setup, and there are also some row level policies that we have set up for this database. Now let's take a look at what exactly the code to implement these API endpoints and the user interface of the sidebar looks like. Okay, so we'll start with the sidebar user interface, and then we will look at the actual API endpoints. Okay, well, this is taking a second to load up. But once this is loaded, you can see here now that we have in our main page. So let's go to the page index.js, which contains the main code. Let's zoom in here a bit. So in index.js, you can see that we have the nav bar as usual. We have the history, the message input, and all of that. So that is this page that we're looking at. So we have all of these things. All of this is exactly the same. But you'll see here that there is a component called layout. So everything has been placed inside a component called layout. Let's find where layout is. So layout is actually inside src/components. And inside src/components, we have layout.js. And in layout.js, you can see here we have a left sidebar. So it is a flex box. So it's basically like a flex container, and it contains a left sidebar, and then it renders whatever children are present inside it. So the layout contains this left sidebar, and that is a common component that has been used across various pages. Let's open the left sidebar. And in the left sidebar, here's what we have. So the first thing we do is we get the Supabase client, we get the current user, and we have this get conversations function over here. What it does is from the Supabase client, from the conversations table, it gets each conversation, and then it also gets the details of the messages for each conversation. And it also checks to only get those conversations that match this particular user ID. Okay. Now the row level security policies will prevent a user from accessing any other conversations anyway. But in any case, we have added this check so that we are making sure that we get only this user's conversations. And now if there is an error, we say there's an error to retrieve conversations. Otherwise, we get the list of conversations. And what do we do with it? Well, the sidebar is hidden by default. So if it is hidden, then we render a button. We render this button over here like that. And clicking on the button is going to open up the sidebar. So we render the button. And if you click on the button, that changes the value of the show variable, the show state. And if it is open, then we show the sidebar over here. And in this sidebar, we basically have given it a certain width, and we have this button over here called new chat. So new chat is simply going to take us back to jobot.jovin.com, the root page. From, let's say we are on one of these pages, like what is the meaning of 42? Yeah, I can just click new chat to go back to the main page. And we also have this button over here to close things. So that is the button that you see right here. And then we take the list of conversations and map over the conversations and render a bunch of links with a chat icon. So this is what we are rendering. So we're taking the list of conversations for that user, and we're simply showing them as a list. And each of these is a link. And that link is going to take us to a different page, which is /conversations/conversation ID. Now this page can be found here. So inside SRC pages, we have added a new page called conversations, where you can see here that we now have a conversation page, and that conversation page has an ID here. So what we do is on the server, when we are picking things up, we create a Supabase client, we get the current user, then we get the current conversation based on the current ID, and we return that conversation as a prop to our component. And then our component over here is going to take that conversation, and it is going to then set that conversations messages as the history for our OpenAI client, so that when we send new messages, that gets updated. And then there is this handle send function that is going to manage all of this business, which is where it's going to first maybe get the completions and then going to update the conversation. So there's that handle send function. We'll come to it. But what we do here is, again, we render the layout and then we simply render the message history and we render the message input. All right. So this is the message history and this is the message input over here. And when we type a new conversation, so what about 89? What happens is this handle send function is called. So let's check out what happens in the handle send function. So, well, we just call the send messages function over here with the new set of messages, and that's going to give us the new history. Then we figure out which messages already have a message ID. So which messages are already present in the database. We figure out which messages don't have a message ID. So which are the messages that need to be saved into the database. And then we insert those new messages. So the messages that have been, let's say the message entered by the user and the message returned by Jobot, the new messages, and we save those into the messages table against the same conversation. So we set a conversation ID as well. And if we get an error, we show the error. Otherwise, we update the history accordingly, and that's it, right? So it's as simple as that. We are simply taking the new message. We are first sending these messages, the new messages that have the user's message to Jobot. That is going to give us a Jobot message. We're going to take those two messages. We're going to add them to our conversation, and then we're going to simply update our state so that all messages have a proper ID. And that's it. So that's what happens on a particular conversation page. And a similar, and what happens on the new chat page is something similar. Let's say I just type here, what is the meaning of 99? And I come back in here. What's going to happen here is in index.js, you can see that there is this handle send function on the main page as well. And what it does is it simply takes the set of messages that have been entered. So the system prompt and the user prompt, it's going to send that to Jobot, get back all three messages. Using all those three messages, it is going to insert into the conversations table. So it's going to create a new conversation first, and then it is going to insert those messages against that conversation. And then it is going to redirect to this URL /conversation/conversation ID. Okay, so basically what we're doing is when you're on the new page or the new chat page, you type a message, we take that message and we send it to the chat completions API, get back all three things, and then save all of them into the database, and that creates a conversation history. Okay, so that's basically it, and that is the entire user interface. A similar thing you will see against each skill as well. So on a particular skill, when you try to send a message, the exact same thing happens. But now let's look at the APIs, the API endpoints that we've defined. And again, the code here is relatively straightforward. It's just that this is a little bit of Next.js specific code, so you do need to become familiar. And again, you can use the code explainer on Jobot to do that. So let's check the send OTP function over here. The send OTP endpoint, which is this one, generate OTP, it takes an email and it simply generates an OTP. So here's what it does. So first thing we do is we set a bunch of headers so that this can be used from any application. Then we make sure that this is a post request. If it's not a post request, we say it's not supported. We make sure that there is an email present in the request body. And then we create a Superbase client. And then we simply call superbase.signin with OTP. And if there's an error, we return that error. Otherwise, we send back the response verification code sent. Really straightforward. Then let's look at verify OTP. What does that do? Well, a similar thing here. It gets a bunch of headers. It checks that this is a post request. It gets the email and the code. So remember, for verify OTP, we have an email and we have a code. So we take the email and the code. We create a Superbase server client. And then we call the verify OTP. So the trick here is we need to do it twice, once to check whether it's a sign in and once to check whether it's a sign up. That's why we check once as a magic link, which is a sign up, and the second time, which is a login, and the second time as a sign up, which is just a new account creation. So yeah, if we get an error while trying to sign in, we try to sign up. But regardless, once we get the user, then we are in a position that we can now go ahead and generate an API key. So once we are able to log in the user, what we do is we want to generate a new API key, and the actual key itself is a primary key. It's going to get generated automatically. All we need to do is give it a key name and the user ID and insert it into the API keys table. And that is going to give us back this API key as a response. And that is what we send back. So this is the response that we ultimately send back. And this API key is ultimately coming directly from the database. All right. And that is how you verify the OTP. Next, let's look at conversations. So there are two conversation API endpoints. There is one which is going to get the list of conversations. So here is get user conversations and create a new conversation. So these both use the same endpoint. Only the method is different. So here's what we do in the get conversations endpoint. We create a Supabase client. We get the current user essentially, and we check if the user is not present. Maybe there might be a bug here, so I might want to actually verify if the response that we get looks fine to me. Okay, we'll verify this later. So yeah, so we get the user and then we take the user, and if the user is not present, we say that this is unauthorized. But if the user is present, then if the request method is get, then we call get all conversations. Otherwise, if the request method is post, then we call create new conversation. And both of these are going to send out the proper response after making the database operations. And otherwise, we say method not allowed. So let's take a look at get all conversations. All we do here is from the Supabase client, from the conversations table, get the conversation and join it with the messages table and get all the other things as well. And then we also make sure that it is for this particular user. And so we simply send back the response for that particular conversation, and that's it. On the other hand, if we try create new conversation, in this case, we are going to get from the request body, we're going to get the messages, we're going to get the title, and we are going to make sure that the messages has a proper, it has at least one message. Then we are going to create a new conversation. So here's where we are creating a new conversation. We're going to insert the user ID and the title. That's all we need to create a conversation. And we get back that conversation. Then we take the bunch of messages that we have, insert into them the conversation ID. And finally, we insert those messages into the messages table with the proper conversation ID. So they are linked to this conversation. And we then return the entire conversation along with the message history. And that's what happens if we try to get a particular conversation, if we try to create a new conversation. All right. So that takes care of these two APIs, list user conversations and create conversations, each just about 20 lines of code or so. So it's not a lot of code that we are writing, but it's allowing us to do some powerful things. Let's check the other API, which is to get the list of messages in a conversation like that. And this one has this parameter in the file name called ID. So what we do is we first create a Supabase client. We make sure that the user is logged in. Then if the request method is get, then we call the get conversation function. If the request method is post, we call the update conversation function. Otherwise, we say method not allowed. So in the get conversation function, we get the request, the ID of the conversation. And then we, from the Supabase table, we call .from conversations. We get that conversation and its messages. We make sure that we are only checking for this particular ID. We get that as a single result. And if we get it, if we don't get it, we return a result. Otherwise, we return an error. Otherwise, we return the result as a proper response. And that's basically what happens. You give it the conversation ID in the URL. There's no body here. And you get back the entire conversation with its messages. Then we have update conversation. In this case, we get again the ID of the conversation, and we take the new messages that have to be added into the conversation, and we add into each conversation, each message, the conversation ID, and we add a await. We basically insert in, we get the conversation itself first initially. Let's see. Yeah. So we first get the conversation itself. So if we get the conversation, that's great. If we do not get the conversation, then we return conversation not found. So let's say if you had something like this, instead of D, you had E here, it would say conversation not found, hopefully. Okay, yeah, it says this is probably something we need to change here. But yeah, ultimately what we do is we then insert these messages into the messages table. And if we get an error in generating the messages, then we return that error. And finally, if there are no errors, then we simply get the conversation just like we had gotten it in the previous time with the entire conversation history and return it. That's it. That's basically what we are doing. And that's how the update conversation works. So you give it a new message, you give it the conversation ID in the URL, and it is going to update the conversation for you. That's all. Now, that basically completes the entire implementation that we're looking at today. And all of this is documented. So if you go to the docs here, if you click on docs, and now if you want to maybe try to build your own mobile app or Discord bot or Slack bot or VS Code extension or anything, you don't actually have to implement this whole thing from scratch. You can just use these REST APIs as a starting point. So you can build on top of these REST APIs and just make your life a lot easier, right? So here's what that looks like. So it's like a hosted backend to interact with Jobot with a bunch of REST APIs. So I'll let you check all of these out. Okay. So that was episode 6, Jobot stripped down memory lane. Now, in terms of what you should do next, well, try using some skills in case you haven't tried using skills already. Try maybe creating the skills, maybe try running the code yourself. Try using the API. So again, you can use a REST client like Insomnia. So the one I'm using is called insomnia.rest. You can create a REST client called Insomnia like that. Download that, or you could use something called Postman as well. That would also work. So try using the API. And finally, if you have any questions, leave a comment or like this video and participate in discussions. So that was episode 6, Jobot stripped down memory lane. Once again, what we built here is this sidebar, and we also built out the REST API so you can interact with Jobot. So try this out. And at this point, we've actually implemented everything that ChatGPT has, plus some additional skills. And the next thing we're going to look at, we've looked at a bunch of things already, but the next thing that we're going to look at is adding speech. The speech support using probably the Whisper API is going to be a very interesting thing to add. Maybe at some point we can try to add a visual avatar as well, and allow or sync the lip movement of the visual avatar to the speech to text, the text to speech that we are using, and see if we can actually create something like a video call with Jobot, right? So that's something that we're going to try and do over time. Thank you for joining. This was How to Build an AI, the Chronicles of Jobot. And I have a good day or good night. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.